Once upon a time, you were so deeply in love, and now you look back on your relationship and you start to think to yourself, this is not the person that I fell in love with. Now, why does that happen, and why is it a common theme in many relationships? Don't feel like something is wrong. Don't feel like you're abnormal to be feeling like this. Let's talk about it a little bit today on this episode of Christian Date Coach. Let's hit it. What's up, everybody? My name is Dr. Phoenix Singh. I want to warmly welcome you to this episode of Christian Date Coach. As always, it's a blessing to have you here with me. Please do, if you enjoy the video, subscribe to our channel, as well as comment below if you have something to say. We always love to hear from you. If you're interested in having me come and speak with your congregation, it would be a real blessing to be able to do that for you. I'll give you those contact details at the end of today's video, but in the meanwhile, you can follow me down here at these social media accounts. Alright, so let's jump right in. I had a client of mine who I spoke with yesterday, and she said something to me yesterday that was very revealing, and it's something that I hear quite often amongst friends of mine, family members, you name it, clients, who are struggling in their relationship, and it could be a young relationship of only a few weeks or months old. It could be a relationship where the individual is married and they've been married for quite a few years. But for whatever reason, there's so many circumstances and so many things that can happen in a relationship. They look back at the beginning of their relationship and say, I was so crazy about that person. I was so deeply in love with them. And now it just seems like that passion has died. And they look back and they see this person who, once upon a time, they wanted to rip their clothes off. They were so incredibly excited about them, so attracted to them. They felt they had everything in common. They felt they were building similar goals together. They had a similar vision for the future. And now all of a sudden, the person is completely different. The thing is that you would be surprised at how common an experience this is. In fact, science would suggest that this kind of happens to every single relationship. So the goal of this video today is for me to speak with you a little bit about this phenomenon and kind of why it is that only, when I say a tiny minority, I'm talking about like under 10%, like way under 10%. I think it's under 5%. I have to check the data again. Of individuals, basically, they don't live in this constant state of, romantic relational bliss, which is very common at the beginning of relationships. So why is that? That's what we're going to chat about today. So I want you to think about your brains, right? This kind of massive jelly in your head, which we really didn't understand for most of human history up until the last few decades. The amount that we've learned from the year 2000 up until today dwarfs all knowledge that we had of the brain for essentially all of human history. It is, to me, the most fascinating organ in the body, and it's certainly one that I would argue is the most impactful, and certainly phenomenologically impactful in terms of our day-to-day lives. So essentially there's three parts of the brain that I want to tell you about today, right? The first one is one that has a really fancy, complicated name, and if you want to be the least popular person at a dinner party, you can say dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC, which is the part of your frontal lobe, which is right up here, which basically is right between your eyes, right? If we kind of took the skull away, took the skin away, that's basically where we would be looking, okay? And this is the part of the brain that usually identifies discrepancies, or identifies things that we would say are kind of wrong in terms of they're off for some reason, right? We would kind of notice it. Why? Because this is the part of the brain where it serves the practical conscious function of judgment. Right? And I'm not talking judgment about like, I'm holier than thou or any of that kind of judgment. I'm talking about literally just the base human, we call it an executive function of judgment. That's what it is, right? And the second part of the brain looks like a little almond, right? And the wrinkly part of your brain, we call it the cerebral cortex, it's underneath that. Think about it like if you got a peach, right, like the fruit, and inside you got the pit. This is kind of like the pit, right? It's kind of underneath, right? And we call that the limbic cortex. And one of the structures that's within it are these little things. There's two of them, one on each side, one for each hemisphere, and they look like little almonds. And the Greek word for almond is amygdala, right? And so that's what we call it, right? Is the amygdala. And the thing about the amygdala is that its function is basically everything having to do with emotion, right? And it serves so many practical functions, right? It protects us from threat. It's one of the reasons why all of us human beings, like, let's put it this way, like on these YouTube videos, right? I get very positive comments, I get negative comments, and, it is a very human thing, and I've heard this from a lot of other YouTubers as well. The negative comments are what they remember. Right? It's so funny. The number of positive comments that you need to have the same emotional impact as one negative comment is quite large, and I find that quite fascinating, right? And it's one of these things that's ironic. If we were out there, walking down the street or something, it's not like YouTube or Twitter where, somebody's going to come right up to you and just, like point in your face and say something. That's incredibly rare. It's basically not going to happen, right? Versus on social media, everybody's kind of, behind this mask of technology, and we find them very consistently acting in ways they would never behave or whatever in real life, in person, right? It's interesting. So the reason why that is, though, is the amygdala. The amygdala activates very heavily in cases of threat, right? This is the same reason why, let's say that you're prepping for a test in college, right? And like right before the test or whatever, you start having almost an anxiety attack, a panic attack. Well, the thing is that we're not evolved to take tests. We're evolved to kind of run from cheetahs, right? But our brain can't really tell the difference. So it's the same primal part of the brain that's lighting up right before the test because you perceive it as a threat. Because in your head, you think to yourself, if I don't do well on this test, I'll get a bad grade. If I get a bad grade, I could fail out. If I fail out, I won't get a job. If I don't get a job, I won't have any money. If I don't have any money, then I will be homeless. And if I'm homeless, then I'm more likely to die, right? It's called catastrophizing, right? And to be able to protect ourselves against that negative emotionality, we do all sorts of things in our lives, right? It drives us forward. In some ways, it's kind of like a little carrot, right, dangling in front of us that we want to run towards, we want to run after it, right? So what happens is that that's the amygdala. It has to do with emotionality, but it's particularly sensitive to negative emotionality, okay? Why? Because we want to learn. There's a great saying, I forget who said it, and you can tell me in the comments below, we could just Google it. But it's that your thoughts die so that you don't have to, right? It is a very unique function of human beings, right? That we have kind of this consciousness and this conscious thought, right? And sometimes we think of an idea, and frankly, it's a terrible idea. And we run kind of that simulation in our head, and we realize, oh man, something really bad would happen if I did that. Right? If I did that particular course of action, then you think about another one, you say, oh, that wouldn't be that bad, right? If I ran down that rabbit hole and I ended up with that action. But what happens is that this first thing that you thought of, that kind of dies. So you say, I'm not going to do that one, right? Why? So that you don't do it in real life and actually die, right? So human beings are just amazing, and the consciousness element that we have really comes from kind of the size of our brain, which has done all sorts of things. In terms of human history, it's fascinating because it's one of the reasons why our period of gestation for 9 months is so long. It's one of the reasons why, in terms of mammalian hips, women have, quite large hips, proportionally speaking. These are just all very interesting things, to me, if nothing else, right? But that's the human brain, fascinating organ. So what happens is that in addition to those two parts of the brain, there's another part of the brain that's called the angular gyrus. Again, one of those things, if you say it at a party, people are probably going to snooze. But when you tell them a little bit more about this, hopefully they'll be a bit more interested, right? What the angular gyrus does is a number of functions, but one of the functions is that it neurologically represents abstract concepts. And when you think about it, your relationship with your partner is kind of an abstract concept. The relationship itself is kind of, you can't see it. You can feel it emotionally, right? But it's not like, like here's a watch. Here's my Apple Watch, right? I can touch that, I can feel that, etc. Right? My brain can code for it. But when you have an abstract concept like justice or different kinds of morality, you could even argue God, right? Can be coded by this part of the brain. I mean, to me, it's just absolutely fascinating, right, what the angular gyrus does. So what happens is that because it abstractly represents relationships, including your relationship with this new individual, or even if you've been dating a little while, it lasts for quite some time, what I'm about to tell you. What happens is that this part of the brain mediates the activation of both that judgment center as well as that negative emotion center, such that when you're actually thinking about, speaking to, etc., that partner that you're kind of falling in love with, or that it's new love, right? It shuts those parts of the brain down. And this happens for, usually it starts ending at about 8 months up until 2 years. You're real lucky if you get to 2 years or whatever before, this thing starts lighting back up, right? And it's almost like a light switch. Now, why the heck would this be an evolved mechanism? Well, it kind of makes sense, right? Within the first 8 months, I mean, only since 1960 have we had, the birth control pill, which is, just a modern phenomenon of science because it's granted women control over their reproductive system. It's quite a fascinating thing. And if you think about it, I mean, we've only had it for 60-ish years? I mean, that's wild that is the period of time where throughout all human history, we didn't have such a thing. So it's just really amazing. It's almost like a social experiment where we are right now, simply because, relative to the amount of time after the pill, that's very tiny compared to the dwarfing history before it, right? And because of that, the dwarfing history before it is what we're evolved to do, right? To adapt to. And so what happens is that people basically are designed to be, having sex, right? And when they do, 9 months later, we got a baby, right? And, women can be pregnant, basically once a year, right? Because every 9 months, right? There's only 12 months out of the year, right? And it used to be something where we didn't have modern medicine, and a lot of children died in childbirth. So, thank goodness, pregnancy could take place that often to be able to help, spread genetic code from one generation to the next, right? And so obviously nature needs to make it feel real good, right? For two individuals to kind of come together to be able to have sex and to be able to, foster a baby. It's an incredibly important task, arguably the most important human task, right? Biologically speaking. So at the end of the day, right? It makes a lot of sense for our brain to shut down anything that's judgmental, negative, or negative in nature, especially negative judgment, right? And we're talking about things like identifying red flags. So for example, oh God, he chews with his mouth open, right? Or, God, she won't stop talking all the time. It drives me nuts. Whatever it is that kind of annoys you specifically. Different people have different things that are pet peeves, right? Whatever those annoyances are, right? The likelihood is very low that you're going to notice them for the first, number of months of your relationship. And this makes sense. And because of that, we end up, and also we don't know a lot about our partner at that stage, so we end up projecting all kinds of attributes onto them that they may not actually have. Now, this is one of the things where if you know the person for quite some time before you start dating, you may be able to kind of circumvent this. But it's certainly the case that oftentimes, you don't really know this other individual well. They're introduced to you via friends, you meet them at work, you meet them at church, you meet them wherever, right? And you don't know them for a year before you start dating, right? And because of that, we project all kinds of stuff onto them, all kinds of expectations and all sorts of things that have been our dreams maybe since we've been children in terms of, what we're looking for in terms of a partner, simply because we don't know a lot about them. And the less they kind of tell us emotionally, so for example, some women are attracted to guys who are, kind of quite mysterious. And one of the reasons why is that these low emotive men who, don't communicate a lot, it's a lot easier to project all kinds of stuff onto them. For example, well, they're not talking, so there must be all sorts of thoughts going on in there. What a fascinating person. I really want to get to know this person better. He must have such high value thoughts that he doesn't just share them with anyone. I want to get close to this guy or whatever and get to know those high quality thoughts. And then oftentimes what happens is you get to know the guy's thoughts, and what he's thinking about is, the pizza or whatever that's left over in the fridge at home, or any number of other things where you're like, I thought that he was like some secret, brooding genius, when it's actually just not the case, just a boring guy, right? And I like to think most of us guys are not that boring, right? But there's certainly a subsection of us that are. So what happens is that it makes sense or whatever that any of those things, though, that would keep us from wanting to have sex with one another, we basically, biology shuts those things down, right? And obviously there's, certain things or whatever that attract us or don't attract us to, the other person. But it's certainly the case that, the brain kind of nature conspires to make us not think about those things until the likelihood is high, like 8 months to 2 years, especially in secular community. And I was an atheist for forever, right? I mean, it's very normal. It would be really odd if you're in a secular relationship in this day and age, right? In terms of contemporary culture, and you're not having sex within 8 months to 2 years. Like that would be quite odd, I can tell you, right? Now, in faith-based communities, there's certainly people who do that. I know tons, right? In terms of, having sex sooner than that. Some people decide to wait for marriage, whatever your preference is. There's all sorts of different types of people. But after you have sex, we're not involved for birth control. So the likelihood is you're going to get pregnant and kind of pass the genes on. So it's like, there you go, right? But then after that period is done, all of a sudden, your brain starts turning itself back on. The light switch goes on. And when the light switch goes on, all of a sudden, these parts of the brain that were kind of dormant, and they're not dormant for everybody, it's mediated by the angular gyrus in terms of the angular gyrus is telling your brain that when you think about this particular individual, you need to shut that negative stuff down. Then all of a sudden when it shuts it back on, like literally the floodgates open and you start noticing, somebody talking too much. You start noticing somebody eating with their mouth open and this kind of stuff. Start noticing all this stuff. And it can be really annoying when you first start to notice these things that you didn't notice before, right? You also start to notice personality things. Oh, wow, he's not very communicative, or she doesn't spend enough time. I don't think she spends enough time with me. Whatever it happens to be, right? But we start to see these things and it causes a lot of friction. And what's happening here, right, is that these parts of the brain are coming back on and we start thinking they weren't like that at the beginning of the relationship. They never did it. They never ate with their mouth open, or we were always spending time together and now there's no quality time, or she used to be so quiet and now it's like, oh, I can't get a moment's silence. Whatever it is with whoever your partner happens to be, right? It is something where this is very natural to happen, where the other person essentially starts becoming a real human being, right? They stop being a projection of your desires. The projection of, I don't like phrases like, the divine feminine and the divine masculine. It's just a little too hippy-dippy for me. But I suppose that would be the idea here, right? Is this kind of projection of this ideal woman in your head that you've built up for guys, or this ideal man that women have kind of built up who's going to do all these things for me. He's going to be my Prince Charming. He's going to X, Y, and Z. All of us have that to a certain extent, right? And it's one of these things where when the other person starts becoming real, sometimes we start losing attraction. Now, if you were to graph out, and we'll talk more about this in another video in terms of what's called two kinds of love. We got passionate love and companionate love. So definitely watch that video. If you type in Christian date coach, companionate or passionate love, right, that should come up for you if the video has been released before this one. And what you'll end up seeing is, so here's the graph, right? So this is time, and this is essentially like how crazy you are about your partner, right? So passionate love spikes fast, spikes early, right? And then what happens is that it kind of plummets pretty early. Like I said, 8 months to 2 years. And then it's never zero, or I hope it's not zero in most relationships, right? It goes along. Ironically, there's really only kind of like one pronounced bump is what research says. And the bump is when the last child in your household leaves the nest. But like I said, it's a bump. The kid's gone, you're gonna get it on, right? But then after a little while, it's gonna go right back to kind of where it was. By the end of the day, that's what you see for passion love, which is that hot, burning passion, right, that you have. Again, you wanna rip the other person's clothes off, right? That's what we're talking about there, right? Relative to companionate love. Companion love is the part of the brain, so if you do brain scan studies, what you see is that the part of the brain that lights up in passionate love, when somebody looks at a photo of somebody they're in passionate love with, the same part of the brain lights up as cocaine, right? Relative to when you are in kind of companionate love, and this love is kind of growing over time, it's like a slow burn love. It's the same part of the brain that activates when we're talking about like smoking pot, like smoking marijuana. It's almost like seeing a beloved family member and it calms you down, etc. It doesn't like get you all jacked up or whatever and jittery because you're so into the other person. Now, this is much more a calming thing. A lot of people who've been with someone for a long time who have really cultivated this sense of companion love reporting that the other person feels like home. And some of you watching this video probably know exactly what I'm talking about, right? This concept or whatever that the other person feels like home. So what happens though is that companion love starts usually at nil, unless you basically have known the person for, a year, or just a long time beforehand, you were friends first. Otherwise, it's kind of starting at nothing. So if you look at the graph, right, versus passionate love also starting at nothing, but it jacks up, right? Companion love starting at nothing, and then it looks like an arc. And the arc grows over time, and it's a slow burn. It's a slow growth, and this is why it's literally a labor of love. I always say on this channel that love is a verb, and I really believe that. it is a conscious choice. You have to wake up and make that decision or whatever to love the other person, right? And it takes effort, and a lot of people want love to be effortless. And you know what they say to themselves? They say, well, this is too much work. Right? Like, true love isn't like this. That's what they'll think to themselves. True love means that everything is easy and everything is straightforward, and that's the kind of love or whatever that I've seen in television and movies. That's the kind of love that I see other people having on, social media, and so that's the kind of love that I want as well. I'm going to break up with the person because it's not easy, or we're going through a hard time, or we need to get to know each other better, or this isn't the person I thought they were before because now they got all these tiny things that really bother me, right? Now, obviously, there's some things that are very bothersome that you should not put up with. Right? I mean, physical abuse, absolutely no, right? Emotional abuse and neglect, also just a terrible thing to do to your partner or have done to yourself. So if you're going through that, please, seek some professional counseling. I think would be very, very good, with a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a nurse, a social worker, MA counselor, right? There's some wonderful professionals out there who I can recommend, as opposed to kind of coaching with me, even though I'm happy to work with you. That sort of thing results in a significant amount of clinical trauma. So I would recommend going to see a trauma-informed specialist. That's what I would recommend. Okay? If it's not a case like that, though, and it's just something where you're just starting to get annoyed by each other, frankly, right? Please know that that's normal, right? Please know that it's not something where it's like they never used to do that. Well, the odds are that they did used to do it and that you just didn't notice, right? Why didn't you notice? Literally because your angular gyrus wasn't allowing you to notice, right? The brain is an amazing thing. Like, we won't remember it, we won't notice it, etc., right? But this happens, I want you to know, in virtually every relationship, right? So many relationships that if you don't experience this, I mean, that's like the weirdest thing, right? Like, this is because it's a neurological, it's an evolved mechanism, right? For that part of the brain in the context of the relationship to basically, go from being largely turned off to all of a sudden largely being turned on, okay? So if the question is, why aren't they the person who I fell in love with? That's a great question. Well, again, you are falling in love. It's passionate love, right? And the thing is that some people take this hedonistic life strategy where basically they're chasing the dragon of passionate love, right? So if this is the graph, right? They get into passionate love, they're addicted to it, then the roller coaster crashes and they break up, right? Before enough companionate love is built. And then they get into another relationship, sometimes like immediately, they just monkey branch from one to the next, and then all of a sudden they're in passionate love again, and then it crashes. Passionate love again, they keep doing that, right? And there's only so much time that you have, right, to be playing those games before it catches up with you, right? If you're in a situation like that, I highly recommend that if and when the current roller coaster crashes and there's a breakup, that you really spend some time single. Being single is really underrated, I would say. There's so much healing that can take place, and also there is no time that you will be able to get as close to God and really be as compliant with God as He desires in His love, right, as when you're single. There just isn't, right? Paul tells us this in Corinthians. Is it Corinthians or Ephesians? You guys are wrong. But just overall, it's very important to understand that there are beautiful and wonderful things about being single. And remember, as I've talked about in another video on this channel, about the difference between aloneness, loneliness, and solitude, right? That sometimes what we need is basically to recharge our spiritual iPods or iPads, right? By, plug them into the wall, which in this case is reconnecting to the vine, right? Which is God, right? And reestablishing and cultivating that relationship with Jesus is something that you will never regret for the rest of your life. It will make everything in your life so much smoother. You got to trust me on this. Oftentimes we just don't believe that that's the case. Or we say, I've tried in the past, didn't do anything for me, Let me tell you, that's fair enough, right? But I can tell you that God honors your time, right? And God deeply honors you speaking to Him, just like any friend, right? So often or whatever, we don't talk to God or whatever like we do to our friends, which is so ironic, isn't it? Let alone to our parents, right? So like for my parents, I try to call them at least once a week. Love my parents deeply. They're awesome. Been married for over 45 years. Love you, Mom and Dad. Amazing marriage. And it's one of these things where it's ironic that some weeks I spend more time talking to my parents on that call than I do talking to God. And I would bet that I'm not the only one or whatever watching this video or whatever who does that too. right? Now that's something luckily that I've been working on a lot more lately, and it's been going really well. But I can tell you that all of us, regardless of, how spiritually mature we are, we go through these ebbs and flows, right? In terms of our connectedness to God and our willingness to spend time with Him. Because I can tell you right now that He's always willing to spend time with us, right? We just have to actually tap in. It's very important, right? In any case, I'm hoping that right now that this has been some helpful information for you. I'm an evidence-based guy. I always like looking at the literature, especially anything having to do with psych, including neuropsych and cognitive neuroscience in this case. And I'm hoping that if you're in a situation where you're starting to feel like, I don't know, you almost feel like you're falling out of love a little bit, the likelihood is that you're transitioning out of passionate love. You've experienced or are experiencing the crash, and you need to focus now on the companionate love element, right? Which again, if you foster it, if you work at it, it's going to grow over time. If it's something where your partner is not interested in that, you want to put labor into the relationship, you want to improve your communication, you want to do more things together, build some shared experiences, get together emotionally more in terms of connectedness. If they're not interested in that, and all it was a physical or a sexual attraction, initially, happens all the time. I mean, it happens absolutely all the time, right? Then you may want to start reevaluating the relationship. If the other person just doesn't want to kind of play on the battlefield of love with you, this is a two-player game. God designed it to be a two-player game, okay? So just keep that in mind in terms of your journey as it is right now. But certainly don't throw the relationship away just because all of a sudden, over the course of the first 2 years, you start being like, I don't want to rip this person's clothes off anymore. I'm not as physically attracted to them as I initially was at the beginning here. There's so many layers to relationships, and maybe it's time to dig a little bit deeper. All right, everybody, thank you so much again for joining me today on this episode of Christian Date Coach. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, either to speak to your congregation or for one-on-one or group-based date coaching, it would be a pleasure to be able to do that with you. You can contact me via the website below, and let's go ahead and chat about it. That would be a lot of fun, I hope, for both of us. All right, everybody, signing off for the day. God bless you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, no matter where you find yourself on the globe. And don't forget to get out there, take chances, and be your best self. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for stopping by. If you enjoyed that episode and you'd like to see more original content, then please do click on one of the links right here. I hope to see you in the next one.